Hello and welcome to Vendor Trash. Is the title a reference to my opinions, my drawing skills, or both? That's for you to decide. Players need to be protected from themselves. Players absolutely hate being told this by devs, but it's more true than you might think. Yes, at the end of the day, you can always argue, it's my free time, it's my choice how to spend it, but at least in a multiplayer game like WoW, I would argue it's the responsibility of the devs to rein in degenerate player behavior. First off though, what exactly do I even mean by this quote? Well, it could apply in different situations, but I think its primary use is to keep players from doing anything in the game so much that they begin to suffer for it. And usually this occurs when any given thing that a player could be doing is too lucrative. For example, let's say that any mob you killed out in the open world had a 1 in 10,000 chance of dropping a myth track item. A naive dev might think, hey, what a nice surprise for whoever this happens to drop for. It'll make their day. A responsible dev would quickly realize that any player who cares at all about power progression would feel compelled to farm mobs out in the open world until they were fully kitted out. And they would do this even if they found the activity of farming open world mobs to be absolutely mind-numbingly excruciating. This is of course a very exaggerated example, but the same logic can apply at any level. This is the main reason that things like time gating exists, not just so they can drag out subscriptions like a lot of people would like to claim. Time gating is actually an extremely useful tool for cultivating the sort of culture you want to exist in your game, and to not include it in any capacity in your multiplayer game can be pretty reckless. Now, before I delve into specific examples, I do want to clarify that I do think that free grinds should still exist within WoW. It can be very satisfying to just sit down and do whatever activity for a few hours and feel like you've made some progress. But by and large, these sort of unlimited grinds should be relegated to optional and cosmetic rewards. Basically, anything involving fishing is a great example of this. It can be very therapeutic for players to just sit there fishing while watching YouTube videos or listening to a podcast or something. Heck, maybe you're fishing in-game right now while listening to this video. But importantly, the only sort of player power that fishing provides is meat that can be cooked for food buffs. And you can just buy that from other players anyways, so who cares? And there are a bajillion such grinds in the game, and they should continue to add more, because these can be done when the player wants, to the extent the player wants, and they just help fill content gaps. A lot of this stuff you can just do in the lull at the end of most expansions. Bizarrely enough though, some players will still burn themselves out doing these completely optional activities. A recent example that I bore witness to was the Seasbarg mount grind. For this mount, you first have to kill a rare spawn in Ajkahet named Taka Katath, which will then start you on a quest to collect 1500 Nerubian chitin, then 1000 Nerubian Venom, and finally 500 Nerubian Blood. Now, for the most part, these items can drop from any level 80 Nerubian. And for anyone who didn't notice, we are currently fighting mini Nerubians. There are of course a bunch out in the open world. They can be a delve enemy. Obviously there's an Arubar Palace where it can drop, as well as 2 of the current dungeons, although that last bit doesn't really help that much since you don't loot mobs in M+. Now personally, having had the quest in my logs for about 2 months now, I'm at about 700 chitin, which means I'm still not even halfway done with the first segment of the chain, and I think it's quite likely that we will be fighting less Nerubians in the latter stages of the expansion. So we may very well hit a point where I just need to grind out the rest of them. But as it stands, I have saved myself the effort of grinding out the first 700 chitin. Yet a week or 2 into the expansion, I was seeing posts about people complaining how exhausted they are after finishing the grind. And if it was really important to you to get the mount that quickly, more power to you. But if it really exhausted you that much, I have to question why you didn't work smarter instead of harder. And again, this was for a purely cosmetic reward that you have all the time in the world to obtain. So just imagine how players will behave when actual power is involved. Now, I wasn't super active at the time, but one of the earliest examples I can think of occurred during Wrath of the Lich King. Trial of the Crusader and Icecrown Citadel were the first 2 raids where you could adjust the difficulty through the in-game menu instead of an organic way like Ulduar. Additionally, raiding at the time was still split into 10-man and 25-man, and because this was basically uncharted ground for Blizzard, a lot of players felt like they had to complete each raid on 4 different difficulties every week: 10-man normal, 25-man normal, 10-man heroic, and 25-man heroic. This caused a lot of burnout, and Blizzard had to do something about it. I believe in Cataclysm, they just had 10 and 25-man raids share a lockout, and patch 5.4 introduced the concept of flexible raid sizes. Now you can can certainly still get worn out on a raid. Usually if you're progressing heroic, you'll still be dipping your toes in normal, and if you're progressing mythic, you'll still be dipping your toes in heroic. But I'd say things are at an acceptable level nowadays, and the presence of Mythic Plus helps keep the content a little more varied. Leaping way into the future, I'm going to touch on Mop Remix and some of its notorious grinds. The game mode was sold on having basically limitless power progression, so of course players found the most efficient way to gain that power and funneled all of their effort into it. By far the most egregious example of this was killing gulp frogs on the Timeless Isle, which Blizzard of course nerfed after a little bit, and if your character happened to have a suspicious amount of gulp frog kills, a lot of their progress would be rolled back. But the madness certainly did not stop there. Just reading Wowhead articles in the following weeks, you would see goat farm nerfed, crane farm nerfed. The most cutting edge players just kept moving to the next most lucrative farm spot. To my understanding, it did sort of work itself out eventually. By the end of Remix, everybody was just ridiculously overpowered and basically soloing raids. And the whole game mode was kind of meant to break the rules in a sense. But is anyone going to seriously argue that killing frogs on the Timeless Isle for a day or two was the ideal gameplay experience you wanted to be served? Sometimes you ran into this issue with reputation rewards. Reusable augment runes were usually available at Exalted or Max Renown with a reputation, so players would do absolutely everything to race to that point, including race changing to human because they had 10% extra rep up until the War Within. In my opinion, only World First Raiders should ever be race changing for gameplay reasons. And there are certainly other examples in WoW's history, but I feel like all others pale in comparison to the infamous AP grind, referring mostly to the artifact power grind of Legion and the Azerite power grind of Battle for Azeroth. Now, I call them grinds because that's what everyone in the community did, but it always felt really bizarre to me because from my perspective, the AP grind was never real, which is to say that I feel that for 99% of players, there was no point to it. Let's look at artifact power, for example. As you collected AP from literally any Legion content, you would eventually be able to spend a point in your artifact weapon. The second point would cost more artifact power, the third point even more than that, the fourth point more than that, and so on. In effect, this meant that the more you progressed your artifact weapon, the less your efforts going forward would produce, and the more it became a waste of your time to even try. On top of that, Blizzard also implemented the artifact knowledge system. This basically multiplied all of your AP grinds more and more as the expansion progressed. And the system was implemented basically as a catch-up mechanic so that if you came into the game 6 months late, you weren't permanently super far behind. In my opinion, it was actually a pretty well thought out system, but players only interacted with it in one of two ways. There were players like me who basically treated it as a completely passive upgrade system. And then there were players that saw that this was a system that made you stronger and concluded that they needed to engage in the system as thoroughly as possible. And I will absolutely concede that these players were probably always about 1 to 3% stronger than I was. But to maintain that 1 to 3%, they had to keep grinding AP throughout the entire expansion. And of course, as always, they found the most efficient way to do so, which was to farm Maw Souls, which was the fastest of the Legion dungeons, having only 3 bosses and not that much trash. So let me frame the whole situation as I saw it. Blizzard created a progression system that could be done with any activity in the game you desired, made each step of those upgrades dramatically more expensive than the last one, and made it so that at any given time, your efforts 2 or 3 weeks from now would be rewarded significantly more than your efforts on the current day. Basically doing everything they could to disincentivize you from actively farming this stuff out. And players still opted to burn themselves out trying to get as much AP as possible as quickly as possible, and then complained endlessly about it on the forums. Azerite power during BFA did operate a little differently, but by and large it was the same system. And again, players burned themselves out on it and complained about it on the forums. Now, I never actively farmed AP. I treated the system completely passively, and I was fine. I managed to get AOTC every season, which is my general goal, and I never really felt like I was weaker than my guildmates. That's why, from my perspective, the AP grind is an illusion that the WoW player base tricked themselves into. And I'm sorry if it feels like I'm calling you guys out here, but I have to call it like I see it. In fact, the AP grind traumatized players so much that a not insignificant portion of the player base incorrectly extrapolated that onto anima power. Anima power was like 95% used for cosmetics. Though I have to be fair, Blizzard actually deciding to add another AP of any sort was a very stupid decision. Like, someone had to realize the optics were going to be bad. Though I almost think Blizzard should have just ran with it. As spectral power was a term thrown around a lot in Dragonflight, they should have just made a currency with that name. And keep it going, the War Within could have added Algari power or something. But yeah, as I said earlier in the video, the main solution to this is simply time gating. And I think the best form of this comes in seasonal caps. If I'm remembering correctly, and I'm probably not, Conquest was one of the first things to implement this. Way back when, you had so much Conquest you could earn every week, and if you missed it, you were just behind the whole season. Eventually, they made it so you could earn up a portion of the conquest you missed out on, and eventually all of it. Nowadays, there are a bunch of currencies that operate on this seasonal cap system. Basically, in week 1 of a season, you can earn, let's say, 100 of a currency. In week 2, you can earn another 100, but if you missed out on week 1, you can earn up to 200. This makes it so people get the satisfaction of gradual progression, without feeling compelled to grind everything out right away at the start of a season, but also fully enabling players to catch up if they come in later in the season, or if they just happen to miss a week. You're still putting in the same amount of effort, but the whole system is just a lot less stressful, and a lot healthier. So yeah, in general, I would say when it comes to power, players absolutely need to be protected from themselves. When it comes to cosmetics, I'd say address it on a case-by-case basis. Some things should just have unlimited grindability to them, and some things should have daily or weekly limits. I like some of my rewards being delayed for whatever reason. I don't want everything to be available to me the very first day. But yeah, however Blizzard decides to handle things in the future, I think we as players can benefit a lot from just remembering that this game is a marathon, not a race. The game has been around for 20 years after all. If you just keep trying to do everything to the max, you're gonna crash and burn. It's inevitable. Just take a chill pill. It's okay if you miss a lockout occasionally. I promise you, you'll be fine. For this week's drawing, I found it only fitting to draw a character most associated with one of the AP grinds, Magni. Champion! Azeroth needs you! Collect the Azerite and heal her open wounds! Yeah, Magni Bronzebeard is an interesting character. He didn't really do much before Cataclysm, except send us to kill his son-in-law. Then he tried to commune with Azeroth, got turned into a diamond, and frozen until Legion. And he basically took over Khadgar's position as the expansion guide for Battle for Azeroth. Then disappeared again until the War Within, where he's been focusing a lot more on rekindling his relationship with his daughter and fostering a relationship with his grandson. And of course he has shed his diamond skin for a flesh and blood body again. But of course I still had to draw him in his diamond Thragar form. He's just way more iconic that way by this point. And I did opt to go with his more muted color palette from the War Within, as opposed to the more vibrant blue from Battle for Azeroth. I didn't give him Fearbreaker just because I feel like it's not that iconic to him, and it's already been in Anduin's hands, Bane's hands, and Moira's hands, the last of which currently holds it, but I feel like she'll pass it on to Dagran at some point. So I just gave him 2 copies of the other mace he wields. And I set him in the middle of Ironforge because, hey, he was king, and who else am I going to put here? And I think we can all agree that Ironforge is a great city, and it's a shame it doesn't see any love anymore. And as a primarily Horde player, I very rarely see it. I also considered drawing him down in Old Ironforge, where he was frozen for several expansions, but I decided to go with the Great Forge area instead. It's a lot more iconic, and it just feels warm and comfy. And that wraps things up here. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next week. Bye-bye.